Chapter 7. After supper, Calvin's interrogation of Petey continued. He finally determined that food on Petey's sheet had lured the mice. "I'll clean your sheet before we go to bed," Calvin said, "and stay awake to help chase away the mice." "Goo, goo," Petey grunted. "'Cause I can wake you up easier. Let me watch first." Petey nodded. That night, Petey fell asleep even before the lights were off. It seemed only minutes before Calvin's voice stole into his dreams. "Hey, Petey, wake up." Petey blinked, staring into the darkness. "Wake up, Petey, it's your turn. I can't stay awake no more. I chased away 3 mice. Are you awake, Petey?" "Aye, aye," Petey squeaked as quietly as he could. For a week the watch continued. Soon the mice quit coming. Except for Calvin brushing crumbs from Petey's sheet, the two were no longer kept their nightly vigil. Petey missed his little friends and worried about Esteban and Sally, his 2 favorites. They had been like a family. Now their loss brought painful tears. Petey craved a family. It was as if his mind knew of love and devotion, but the feelings must have only been his imagination. Nothing Petey remembered was ever so special. Calvin had set aside part of this void. Though retarded, his shortcomings were offset by sheer determination. Calvin doggedly deciphered Petey's grunts and gestures until he captured basic notions. With effort, he wove the notions like threads into an idea, eventually forming a concept. Once captured, Petey and Calvin paraded the shared understanding back and forth between them like proud captors of a snared rabbit. Calvin's tenacity made him a dreaded presence on the ward. His endless questions and opinions tested each patient's endurance. In his spare time, Calvin began disassembling everything he touched. He never quite remembered how to reassemble his destruction. The last straw fell the day he reduced his wheelchair to scattered tires, pads, tubes, and a headrest. "Calvin," the attendant scolded, "knock it off. You take one more thing apart, I'll take your wheelchair away and you can stay in bed. You hear me?" Reluctantly, Calvin agreed. After that, he began grabbing the handles on Petey's wheelchair and shoving him a few feet. Wheeling himself forward, he repeated this motion. Soon Calvin could position both chairs near the windows without depending on the attendant. He spent full afternoons pushing Petey around the ward. One day, Calvin spun Petey in circles. Petey flailed his arms and grunted to stop, but Calvin spun him faster and faster. When he finally let the dizzy Petey roll to a stop, Petey threw up all over himself. "Oh boy," Calvin explained, "if you did that when I was spinning you, it would have splattered everyone." Petey mustered his most severe scowl. Late one afternoon, Calvin wheeled up to Petey. "Hey, Petey, I've been thinking, you gotta learn more words. If you can say yes, no, and good, you can say other stuff too." Petey shook his head, but as he sat alone, staring out the windows, he began mouthing words he'd heard. It took so much effort to close his lips, he could not make a sound at the same time. His throat felt like something gripped in a clamp. The biggest problem was his tongue. Jutting sideways in his mouth, the tongue gnarled about, defying any command. When forming words, it fell short of contacting the top of his mouth, leaving air to rush past. It helped to press his bottom lip against his upper gum. Petey realized the best way to make any good sound was the way he said E, A, O, and goo. He had to use his throat. The first success came with the words "pretty good." Squirreling his cheeks back and almost humming, he grunted out a very rough "prefer goo." He could utter this without using his tongue. Over and over he practiced. The next morning Calvin wheeled over. "Hi, Petey, how are you doing?" "Perfect goo," Petey grunted. Calvin stared. "Perfect goo." Calvin tipped his head sideways. "You telling me something?" Petey nodded. Calvin skewered his face and thoughtfully scratched his hand. "Let me think. I asked how you was doing, and you said perfect goo. You mean pretty good?" "Aye, aye." Calvin broke out laughing. Petey smiled and puckered his cheeks again in the guttural but jubilant "perfect goo, perfect goo." The next day, Petey learned the word goodbye. Unable to say good night, this was the nearest he could think of, and again it exacted great effort, but he grunted a coarse goodbye. Before long, the whole ward listened each night to the good night salutation conducted in 2 corner beds. "Good night, Petey." "Goodbye." The joy of learning to communicate with Calvin helped temper Petey's loss of the mice. But Petey worried about Calvin. The boy either boiled over with motion and laughter or sat secluded in total silence. Some days he spent whole mornings at the day-room table, slumped over, head tucked in his arms. Each day, Petey sat silently by the window. Often he watched the round glass thing on the wall. During the last year, the object had captivated his attention, holding him spellbound for hours, long hours at a time. The device had two little levers or rods. One of the levers was longer than the other. The longest one went around and around, maybe a dozen or more times a day. The shorter one barely moved. If lucky, it went around once a day. Petey learned to predict meal times by watching the levers. Watching the movement of levers became more satisfying than looking out windows. The windows left him longing to reach out his hand and touch the wind or feel the sun against his face. The old memories of his trip over from the infant's ward had dulled in his mind, and with each rotation of the lever, the memories came more from imagination. Maybe he had never really felt the sun in the wind. One day, blustery weather rolled in over the grounds. Wind howled down from a threatening sky. As Calvin and Petey sat together at the far end of the ward, Calvin began clowning around. "Look how I can spin," he said, pushing opposite directions on his tires. The chair rammed the wall and tipped over. Calvin pitched forward and fell from the chair. With a dull thud, his head hit the wooden floor. He groaned and struggled to get up, then collapsed and lay still. Petey grunted and tried to wave his arms, but nobody noticed. He sat frozen in numb silence. His best friend needed help, and all he could do was sit helplessly in his wheelchair and grunt like an idiot. Chapter 8. Calvin lay deathly still. Try as he might, Petey could think of no way to help his friend. He cursed his useless body. All it could do was choke on food when he tried to eat, and hours later make a mess that somebody else had to clean. Anger filled Petey. He was alive and he could think. That was worth something. Somehow he must help Calvin, and soon. Suddenly, Petey drew in a deep breath, shooting a sharp pang into his chest, then doing something he had never dared before. He forced air into his stiff, pinched throat. A siren squeal pierced the air. Grimacing, Petey thrashed his arms, hitting the wall and window moldings. Jolts of pain bit at his wrists, and black darkness drowned his vision. Still he flailed his arms. Two powerful hands grasped Petey's arms. Petey opened his eyes to look up at the attendant. "Hey, hey, hey, hold on, fellow, I'm here. I'll get help for Calvin." The attendant shouted across the ward to the other attendant, "Go get help." Petey watched as a huge man crouched over Calvin's motionless body and felt for a pulse. Calvin groaned and tried to sit up. Grimacing, he reached for his head. "I hit a truck," he grunted. In minutes, a nurse ran in. Except for a fist-sized knot on his head, Calvin was okay. The big attendant eyed Petey as if sorting out a puzzle in his mind. "That was good what you did," he said, examining Petey's scraped and bruised hands. "Let's get something for the cuts." When the attendant returned with bandages, he squeezed Petey's shoulder. "You sure ain't no idiot." Petey smiled. Then he closed his eyes again and let darkness bathe his mind and body. Later, Calvin wheeled over to where Petey lay spent and hurting. Petey, I heard what you did for me. Thanks." Calvin looked down. "Petey, you're my best friend." Again, Petey smiled and forced a nod. "I didn't know you could scream," Calvin blurted. The big attendant, Joe, who had come to Calvin's rescue, had started working on the ward only a few days earlier. Joe had muddy brown hair, a squared jaw, and walked a bit slowly, as if each step pained him. Within a few days, Calvin wrangled out of him his name and life story. Joe had worked for years on the Milwaukee and Northern Pacific Railroads as a Gandy dancer, pounding railroad spikes to the Gandy's cadence. A disease in Joe's muscles finally made it too painful to swing his hammer any longer, but still he hummed the songs of the railroad. As the summer of 1937 faded into autumn, Joe's strength ebbed. By first snow, simple tasks demanded a monumental effort. Petey noticed Joe's decline, but had no idea what was wrong. "What you got planned today?" Joe asked one morning as he grunted to roll Petey face down for cleaning. Pressure on Petey's chest kept him from answering. Joe filled in the silence. "Gonna put soup on my chair again?" Petey grinned. Last month, Joe had brought a bowl of soup into the day room for a feeding. Seeing the table cluttered with trays and plates, he set the bowl on a bench while he returned to the food cart for a spoon. On returning, he accidentally sat squarely in the bowl of steaming chicken noodle broth. Petey had howled laughing as Joe leaped up in surprise, breeches hot and dripping. "You sure have grown, buddy," Joe said, allowing Petey to flop again onto his back. "You're a teenager now." "Aye," Petey said. Joe grimaced as he hefted Petey into a wheelchair. "I bet you weigh 120, he said, breathing heavily. Petey eyed his big friend fondly. After rescuing Calvin, Joe had become like a father. Nobody on the ward messed with Petey or Calvin without answering to Joe. "I don't know how much longer I can keep working," Joe said sadly. "What?" Petey pleaded. Joe shook his head, not answering. With a loving tweak on the chin, he pushed Petey into the day room for breakfast. As usual, Calvin waited at one corner of the table, his wheelchair crowded by patients already devouring their meals. Seeing Joe and Petey enter the room, Calvin extended his index finger like a pistol and clicked his throat to mock gunfire. K-k-k. Petey smiled and flailed his arms, returning the gunfire. K-k-k. Laughing, Calvin turned his pretend gunfire on Joe. Petey joined in, helping spray their big friend with imaginary bullets. Joe clutched his chest with one hand and steadied his mortally wounded body with the other. Petey watched Joe reeling in mock pain. This game had started a few months earlier when the attendants had started bringing a big machine up the ward that shined a bright light against the wall. When the other lights were turned out, people could be seen moving and talking on the wall, like magic. This machine could even make horses and buildings appear. Joe called them movies. Every week, Petey and Calvin looked forward to Friday night. Joe sat between them and gave names to the magical people, names like Hoot Gibson, Tom Mix, and Gary Cooper. The boys remembered their favorite movies, The Wild West, The Virginian, Death Valley, The Big Trail, and Billy the Kid. Petey assumed that somehow this machine showed things as they actually happened elsewhere, but one night he watched the Texan for the second time. Puzzled looks and gestures finally coaxed an explanation out of Joe. Somehow the big reels of tape had held the people and could show them over and over. Petey and Calvin loved the movies with cowboys. Their favorite cowboys never got killed in gunfights. After each show, the boys faked pistol battles. Their wheelchairs became magnificent galloping stallions. The dirty, crowded ward filled with beds became a sun-streaked landscape, crisscrossed by mountains and canyons. Docile patients were staring out windows became unsuspecting members of a many roundup posse. Old Zeke, a bedridden miner halfway down the ward from Petey and Calvin, had helped them rob 17 banks, escape from as many jails, and kill a dozen bandits, all without leaving his bed or suspecting his involvement. Calvin, able to move his wheelchair, did all of the sneaking, often running into other patients as he escaped the pursuing posse. Still clutching his chest, Joe interrupted the morning's shootout. "Okay, you two, nobody dies until after breakfast," he ordered. "I hate feeding dead people." Joe parked Petey next to Calvin, then brought oatmeal from the cart and set it on the table. Petey liked oatmeal. It was one of the few times he ate his food the same as everyone else. Usually his food had to be ground through a meat grinder. Each week the menu remained the same. Because of this, Petey knew that for lunch today they would get meatloaf and corn. For him, this would be ground into a burnt-colored pudding with yellow specks, not too unlike his oatmeal. Petey yawned, feeling unusually spent from his shotgun battle. He ignored the weariness, but after only a few bites, he felt nauseated and warm. He signaled Joe that he was full. By mid-morning, Petey had uncontrollable chills and big drops of sweat beading his forehead. After Calvin killed Petey 3 times without a single shot in defense, he wheeled near. "Hey, Petey, I didn't really shoot you. Are you okay? You don't look so good." Ooh, Petey shook his head, grimacing. "I'll get Joe. He'll help you." Calvin angled across the ward, cranking furiously at the wheels and hollering, "Hey, Joe! Hey, Joe! Hey, Joe!" Patients scattered, each harboring memories of bruised shins and pinched toes on Calvin's account. Soon Calvin returned with Joe. "What's wrong, Petey? Not feeling good?" Joe asked, concern on his face. "Owie," Petey whimpered. "Let's get a blanket over you and call the doctor." Joe sent the other attendant to summon the doctor as Calvin wheeled himself frantically across the ward. "I'll get him my blanket," Calvin shouted. Once more patients scattered, flinging obscenities and hazarding remarks from the protection of their beds. Joe smiled. The blanket lay not 10 feet from where he stood, but he couldn't deny Calvin his gesture of friendship. After a long wait, a thin, bony doctor arrived, toting his big black bag. He wore a loose, sloppy gray suit. The doctor shook his head at the sight of Petey. "Poor fellow, got some bug, huh? Well, let's see what it is." The entire ward turned their attention to the doctor's visit. The doctor pulled back the blanket and opened Petey's shirt to expose his chest. Twice he placed a thermometer in Petey's mouth, but Petey's coiled tongue rejected its presence. Finally, he slipped his hand underneath the sheet and placed the thermometer where it could not be rejected, much to Petey's dismay. Next, he touched his stethoscope to Petey's chest and listened. A hush fell over the ward as 50 other patients helped listen. After retrieving the thermometer and completing his examination, the doctor glanced over Petey's medical records. He set his bag on the edge of the bed. We have one sick boy here, he said, producing several bottles and doling out the measured portions of foul-tasting liquid along with several pills. Before leaving, he turned to Joe, who sat holding Petey's hands. He's got a good case of the flu and pneumonia. I've given him some tonic and tinctures. Considering he's an idiot, I wouldn't get my hopes too high. These kinds seldom live long anyway. This child is no idiot, Joe said firmly. The doctor raised a stern finger. Don't let your fondness of a patient jade your perception. This child is an idiot. You cannot change that fact. After making note of the doctor's instructions, Joe watched him leave, then murmured, You're no idiot, Petey. You'll still be around years from now when that doctor is belly up to a gravestone.